afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hort Insights webinar titled Insights into the Drivers of Community Trust and Acceptance of the Australian Horticulture Industry. Thank you very much for joining this virtual event. For those who don't know me, my name is Anthony Kachenko. I'm Hort Innovations General Manager of Data and Extension, and today I will be moderating this webinar. This is our third webinar, where we aim to connect you with the people closest to the research funded through Hort Innovation Investments. For those of you who are first timers, the previous two webinars covered the consumer market environment and disruptions to the food service sector as a result of COVID-19. If you missed these webinars, those recordings are available on our website, as well as the complementary research that can be accessed by visiting our website at www.horticulture.com.au. Now today, we are delighted to have Dr. Kieran Moffat, the CEO and co-founder of Voconic, join me to unpack some of the insights from the community following a baseline survey of Australian sentiment on the drivers of trust and other relevant issues across rural industries, including horticulture. Welcome, Kieran.
G'day, thanks for having me.
Now, before I provide, or Kieran provides a bit more of a background in terms of himself and the research, a couple of bits of housekeeping. First and foremost, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I encourage you, as does Kieran, to put forward some questions so that we can have some rich conversation as we go throughout this webinar this afternoon. Also, each participant is muted and we can't see you. The webinar will be recorded if there are any issues your end where you may drop out, so that you can review the content later on. Now, Kieran, can you provide a little bit of a background about yourself and Voconic?
Yeah, sure thing. So thanks for having me along. My background, personally, I'm a social and organisational psychologist by training. Did a PhD in social psychology a long time ago now, and worked in CSIRO for about 11 years, leading a program of research looking at the relationship between industries and communities at different scales, so locally in small towns and communities, working and living alongside, for example, a large mining company, right up to kind of national perspectives that citizens have about whole industries. And our work in CSIRO was really about this concept of social license to operate. How do we understand the mechanisms that underpin constructive, productive relationships between industries and companies and the communities that they work alongside? Voconic then is that same research team that I lead, spun out of CSIRO to be able to scale the delivery of that science here in Australia and internationally. So this is a decision that CSIRO made as part of a larger strategy to make sure that its science was being exposed to as many contexts as possible. And my team and I have led that out of CSIRO in the last 12 months, and now working with horticulture here via the AgriFutures Australia project around community trust. It's really fantastic to be working in a whole range of new industries to bring that knowledge and experience and thinking to new spaces. So that's my quick background.
Great, thanks. And look, today we're talking a meaty issue, and it's around social license and community trust, which is essentially the community's opinions on a broad range of topics and the implications for the rural industry sector. And today it's all about horticulture. And obviously we want to better understand their motivations for a myriad of reasons, which we'll explore today. We have seen in recent news and media a lot of polarising issues, a lot of pop-up activism, issues such as live export, the withdrawal of glyphosate from retail, cage eggs versus free-range eggs, and so on. So there's certainly a lot resonating in our community. On that note, Kieran, can you share, you mentioned you've been working with other industries. Can you share some of your observations in working with those industries as to why community trust matters?
Yeah, and it is the key question. Why do we talk about trust in this context? Isn't it just about kind of doing what people want you to do, or reducing impacts on environment or welfare or of animals or whatever? But what we found through our work is that trust keeps popping up. And in our work, we want to go further than just understanding, what people think, to understand why they think that way. And I guess CSIRO is such a good, constructive place to do this work and to develop this work, because it's an applied research agency. It's about supporting multiple groups, community, industry, government, to make better decisions and to support Australian industry in sustainable ways. So, in that equation then, we're always thinking about, what is important to having a more supported, more sustainable industry. And in that social science we were doing to understand the nature of the relationships between communities and companies in particular, or industries in particular, what we found in that is that trust in those industries, trust in those companies, was a real kind of what we call a mediating variable between people's expectations and experiences of an industry and their acceptance of an industry, which is our sort of proxy for social license to operate. And what I mean by mediator is that it's a vehicle. So in that analyses that we were doing of survey data in lots of different places at lots of different times about different industries, we kept seeing that it was through trust that experiences and expectations of an industry influenced and predicted acceptance of those industries. And in that way, trust has real utility, that by building trust in an industry with community, we're able to reduce the potential for rejection, the potential that that the community, in say in a mining context, will picket a mine or lock down a site. In an agricultural context, that community will put pressure on policymakers to put a moratorium on live export, or that people will put pressure on a on a retailer like Coles or Woolworths to shift their proportion of eggs dramatically from predominantly caged to predominantly free range in a time frame that's really difficult for an industry to manage in a financial sense, right? It takes some real investment and thinking, and defining your own timetable means having some understanding of and influence over the context in which your industry operates. And trust is really fundamental as a vehicle for allowing industries to do that. So if you can build a relationship with community, you understand their perspectives, you can adapt your behaviours to match those expectations, and also then communicate that good activity to those that influence the way your industry operates. So regulators, policymakers, government as a whole, retailers, and others who have influence over the way an industry does its business.
Why now, Kieran? Why has it become all of a sudden important? Has it always been important? But
I think it's one of those things it's like an overnight success that takes 20 years to achieve. I think actually expectations of community have been shifting and increasing over time, and we've just, for some industries, reached a tipping point around some of those things, particularly where those expectations on the one side are then met by say a retailer on the other side, who are really focused on consumer behaviour, seeing that there's some real opportunity for them to be positioning themselves differently. And actually the problem is that when an industry gets caught in between and it hasn't made the same rate of progress against those issues, you can get wedged really quickly. So I think it's been happening for quite a while, and we're just seeing some tipping points. So it's never been more important, I'd say. Sure. That, absolutely. But I think also community as a whole is exerting more pressure. It has more ways to exert pressure on industries as well than it has at any time in the past. So
look, you've highlighted some salient points there, and I think the rural industries recognise that, and I mentioned a couple of clear examples of where we've seen that in the media. Can you tell me a little bit about the project that a number of rural RDCs are now embarked upon with you, and where's the project at?
Yeah, so the reason why this project is so exciting, it's called the Community Trust and Rural Industries Program of Work. The reason that it's exciting is that it's a collaboration between 11 research development corporations, New South Wales DPI, National Farmers Federation is a key partner in this, and a couple of other groups as well. And why that's really interesting is that that's not typically how this work is done. Typically an industry will do this work itself. But here we have all of these RDCs, all of these industries on behalf of all rural industries coming together to think together about what community trust means to rural industries, and how they can work together to improve that. I mean, it's actually novel, it's very new, and really foundational. So the project itself is over 3 years, and we've just come to the end of the first year. It involves conducting national representative surveys of the Australian community each of those 3 years, and then also now starting to drill down into specific industries now that we've got the first year results, to explore how those industries can apply the insights from the first year to work on improving community trust, and then sharing the experiences of those industries across all rural industries. So it's really fantastic, a dynamic. So we're doing this national piece, we're doing this industry level piece, and then the project itself creates a space for sharing experience and thinking about how we together as rural industries can tackle some big challenges like environmental responsibility, for example.
Well, that's a really good segue to perhaps share some of the results relating to that first year of data capture. So we'll just pull up on the screen some of the data to date. And Kieran, do you want to walk us through some of the results today? Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, I understand this is a busy slide. I'm going to walk you through 3 kind of key things from this data. So first of all, I said at the beginning, we're interested not only to understand what people think, but why they think that way. And how we do that is that we use a survey instrument that we developed in consultation with all of those RDCs and industries to understand the full breadth of issues that relate to rural industries and community trust. So it's very typical, for example, that RSPCA, for example, might do a project around community attitudes towards the egg industry, but their primary emphasis is around the welfare of the hens. And that's absolutely fundamental to community trust, but it's only one of the interaction points that the industry has with community. And so what we try and do in projects like this is to understand the full breadth of issues that are relevant to community trust, and then measure all of those. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, what you can see is that we apply a statistical method called path analysis that tries to understand how it all fits together simultaneously. And let me just explain what that model is saying. So first of all, on the right-hand side, we've got acceptance in that circle, and that's our outcome. That's what we're trying to understand, how everything else predicts it, how everything else feeds into and leads to community acceptance of an industry. And it's our proxy for social license. Now, on the left-hand side, what we've got is 3 light blue boxes, and they're the key things that we found in this work were most important in driving acceptance. And what you can see in the middle there is trust. And what that means is that those 3 things on the left-hand side predict acceptance through trust. So by influencing trust, we influence acceptance. And that's really important to understand, because it means we shift the conversation from how do we avoid rejection by community to how do we build trust with community. And that's a very different question to answer. So the way we go about answering is to understand what is it that drives trust. The 3 key drivers of trust were environmental responsibility of rural industries, so acting as responsible stewards of the land and the sea, operating sustainably. That was the first and biggest, most important driver of trust. The second was industry responsiveness to community concerns. So can they see industries responding proactively to the concerns that communities have? Is there a two-way street here? Or is industry just trying to fudge it and do whatever it wants anyway, and not really caring about what I think as a citizen? And the third is that the more valuable and the more important industry products are in the lives of Australians, the more trust they have in rural industries as well. That's really interesting because it was a bit challenging at first, but actually what I think that means is that the products themselves are the handshake with the Australian community. And so that's why it feeds into this trust equation, if you like. However, what's also really important to understand is where we start from in this work, right? So if that's the model, that's the recipe for improving trust and acceptance, we need to understand where we're starting from. And that's what the other data here is speaking to. What I should mention is that, yes, we're doing one big national survey each year, but because COVID-19 was such a dramatic shock to every system, we thought that it would be useful to go and collect some additional data during kind of April, at the height of that emergency period, to understand in particular how that was affecting community perspectives around horticultural industries and amenities that horticulture industries support. And so what we've got here on the top left are 2 time points. One is the year 1 first big national survey data collection, 6,500 Australians, representative of the national population. On average, the level of acceptance of Australian rural industries was positive, so it was above 3 on a 1 to 5 scale, so 3.6. And then in the second number there, you can see is what that moved to in that April period, which is it got significantly more positive, so 3.85. That is statistically a big jump. And on the right-hand side, what you can see is the ratings of trust that community members have in a whole range of different rural industry actors and industries. And what I've done is to put boxes around those that relate specifically to horticulture sector. So you can see at the top there, nut farmers, fruit growers, turf farmers, and nursery operators, all clustered together there with quite, similar levels of rejection on the left-hand side, so dissatisfaction or lower levels of trust, that's the orange, but then quite varying levels of blue, which is the positive ratings on that same measure. So if you think about the colours as representing a 5-point scale, so the orange is 1, the lighter orange is 2, that middle score is 3, and then light blue is 4, and then dark blue is 5. The blue is really the positive numbers. That's where to be looking. What you can see when you look at that is that there's actually a bit of uncertainty around turf farmers, for example. So, trust there is kind of moderate. And I'll show you a little bit more data about that in a second. But, the thing to take from this is that, 1, acceptance is really strong and positive. That's great. And 2, that trust in horticultural industries and rural industries overall is on average also very strong. So a very good position to start from. And then if you look at individual industries within that, you can see that there's some variation. This slide here then speaks to some horticulture specific items that we included. So those broader set of issues that I mentioned we're interested to understand. And the first thing to note is that top line item, which is that rural industries play a key role in making fresh fruit, vegetables, nuts, plants, and turf affordable to Australian communities. You can see that 85% of Australians either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. That's excellent. That's a fantastic foundation and a really good position to start from in this conversation with community. And for growers and producers in horticulture to understand about themselves, that Australians really value what you do and they think that you provide products for them to consume in a way that's really affordable. I think that's fantastic. What you can also see here is some specific things that we thought would be interesting to understand during the pandemic. So the effect of horticulture products and services on things like mental health, for example. And you can see it's actually a bit of a mixed bag here, that whilst, for example, having plants in my house or apartment do make me feel good, as kind of experienced by about 42% of people. There's 30% of people, 34% of people for whom that isn't really the case. So I think this is interesting because the idea here would be to shift people from the left to the right on these items over time. And that's what we would be working on with people like yourself, Anthony, to help develop strategies to shift people from the left of these models to the right, by understanding how COVID is affecting behaviour and how horticulture products fit into that equation.
Look, thanks for that snapshot of data, and it's actually it does put horticulture in a really good light. I guess, were there any surprises with the results that were captured?
Yeah, there were a couple actually. So one, the big one is that whilst trust and acceptance in rural industries overall and most rural industries individually is really strong and positive, there was also quite a lot of uncertainty in the areas that are the main drivers of trust. Yep. So what I mean by that is that when we looked across all the data, what we saw is that some questions had much more percentage of people answering 3 on a scale from 1 to 5. So they were choosing the middle, which often means that we're not quite sure if I feel like I have enough information or I feel strongly enough about an issue to make a judgment either way, positive or negative. And what we found is that the patterns of responding like that were systematic, which means that they happened in specific areas more than others. And the 2 areas where we saw most uncertainty was in environmental responsibility questions and in responsiveness questions. And you'll remember from that model that those were the 2 top drivers of trust and acceptance in rural industries. And so that presents both an opportunity and a real risk for rural industries, that it's effectively, there's a lot of vacant territory in the areas that are most important to community trust in rural industries. Now, that vacant territory is there to be occupied by rural industries, but it's also available to be occupied by critics of rural industries. And so it's really important, I think, that through this work, we able to identify who in particular occupies that area of uncertainty so that rural industries can focus their attention on those people and helping them to make informed decisions about things like environmental responsibility and behaviour, and also to work on the mechanisms for demonstrating responsiveness to the community. So I think that's probably the biggest area of that was interesting and novel and a surprise for us.
And a big opportunity for growth too, highlighting the fact that there is a story to tell and a component that we can then build off. Look, there's a number of questions that have been coming through, and I note we've only got a few more minutes before we have to wrap up. So I might just turn our attention to a couple of those. The first one is, it's a quick one, the sample pool. Was that across rural and urban Australia? How representative was it?
Yeah, so it was nationally represented. So what we do is we get a representative sample within each of the states, by and large. And it was representative based on gender, education, and age. And then what we also do is we say to our partner who collects the data, we'd like to try and get as many people from regional and remote areas as we can. That can be challenging in Australia, but what we try and do is get an over-representation of regional perspectives, because we want to be able to balance, we want to be able to compare those. And so that hasn't been a big feature of the work to date, but the sample does have quite a few people from regional areas. And what we looked at was, the extent to which people who work in rural industries, and that does have some systematic effects on the results. So the more people in rural industries, the more positive you are on most things. So not surprising, but it does emphasize why it's important to connect people to rural industries.
So building off that theme, there was another question that came through in terms of the proximity of the findings in terms of primary production. So, was there any way that you could look at how prevalent those findings were to those that were maybe on the urban fringe, for example?
Yeah, that's a trickier one to tease apart, because of course, defining those areas of operation and drawing a line between those who live close and further away, and then grades of distance and things like that is challenging. With the granularity of data that we have to play with, it's just a bit complex, and we will be focusing on that in the second year, so be able to do that a bit more easily. That's why we use the number of people who work in rural industries as a bit of a proxy for that. Because what we want to do is to tap into the relational side. So do you have access to more information about rural industries through that network, and does that inform the way that you think about rural industries? And so we did see those effects, but we will be exploring that in some more detail this year in particular.
Yeah, there's a question that sort of builds on that, and it's around how critical in your mind is the power of grower stories in terms of telling and connecting with people. I mean, one of the initiatives Hort Innovation is undertaking on behalf of horticulture across Australia is a sustainability framework where we actually want to share the story and position horticulture proactively to our community and to the broader landscape, if you like. Can you share your thoughts on the power of growers in telling the story?
Yeah, well, actually, first of all, let me just say, I think a sustainability framework is a really excellent mechanism for demonstrating industry level responsiveness. So it's a way for taking data like this and then saying, you told us this and we're doing this in response. So it allows you to show how your R&D investment, for example, is then organized around the issues that are of most interest and challenge to your industry to operate effectively, but also aligned with community expectations and sentiment in some way. I think that's a demonstrated useful thing to do. Growers' stories then become a way to connect at a personal level with that larger agenda. And what's really important, one, is that those stories are authentic, that they don't feel like a greenwash type activity, and that they acknowledge the hard stuff and aren't just feeling like an advertising campaign. That's my view. I feel like that where those stories...
Greenwashing.
Yeah, that they acknowledge the challenges and the difficult parts, as well as those things that you're wanting to sell to Australia, right? That, beautiful fields and things and farms and green vegetables and things are wonderful. But I think what's super compelling in that is when a farmer talks also about the things that are hard. And those are the things that we can all relate to. And that feels like a very authentic story that's then consistent with an R&D investment framework and a sustainability framework that's actually speaking to the hard bits as well as to the positive. And I think that then becomes a more genuine, authentic conversation with the Australian people. And that's where the gains are to be had, I'd say.
Do you think I'll take two more quick questions? There's one in terms of how quickly can the reputation be lost?
Well, I think what's interesting in this is that I have a different view to some other people about reputation and trust. So reputation and acceptance are slightly different things, but let's say they're over here. Trust is a key mechanism for acceptance, at least, maybe for reputation as well. Trust is harder to lose in dramatic fashion than you might expect it to be. And that's the point of building trust. It is what is drawn on when things get difficult. And effectively, I like to think cynically, you kind of cash some of that in when something goes wrong, and you build it so there is some benefit of the doubt in the relationship. So community don't feel like this is, cynically, that you're doing it on purpose or because you don't care or because you weren't paying attention. That things happen with industries, and if you have a strong enough relationship, it can bear the challenge, right? That's what you want to be doing. You want to be building mechanisms too for working those things through. But my observation, and I say this based in recent data we've collected with a customer of ours that has undergone some extreme challenges in the public domain, has suffered a significant impact on community trust in them and their reputation, but it hasn't been like they've lost about 80% of the gains that they'd made through the last sort of 6 months in that space. They didn't drop down to pre-levels, and what that shows to me is that whilst anecdotally we feel like trust disappears in a second, in practice, it's a bit stickier than that. And that's the point of building strong, productive, progressive relationships, is that they should be more mature than a single incident being the destruction of the relationship as a whole.
Well, Kieran, thank you so much for giving us an overview of the research. For those questions we haven't gone through, we will respond offline and make that publicly available on our website with the webinar, with a recording of the webinar, and also the research. I think it's really important to share the story and make sure that those of you, plus others out there in the broader community, can see the results and utilise this information to help tell that great story that we have around the strong and positive acceptance of horticulture. Before we sign off, there is a quick exit poll that I'll ask you that are there still online to complete in terms of today's webinar. Kieran, again, thank you. You've done some great work, and I look forward to seeing the evolution of this over the next 2 years of the research project. So thank you.
No, you're welcome, and thanks everybody for joining us.